My name's Anthony Metivier, and my title is Professor of Memory, I guess.
Can you tell me a little bit about your own mental health journey?
Yeah, it used to be quite intense when I was in university. Had really bad depression, clinical depression, and had to see doctors and stuff like that, and take medication. And unfortunately, none of that really helped because I'm not entirely sure why. But not to make it too long of a story at the opening, but one thing that happened is I started to use memory techniques and I started to feel a little better. And I continued to use medication. I never knew why I was feeling better from using memory techniques, but I read years later research by a head of a research team named Tim Dalgleish, and he talked about how that they use memory palaces to help people with depression, or they did a study. And so these memory techniques involve what are called memory palaces. So I realized later why that probably created this effect. But no doctor ever said to me, hey, did you ever look at your diet or how much alcohol that you drink or anything like that? And so just through random events and so forth, I wound up getting a dietary coach and a fitness coach. And I worked on all these other areas, and then I started to meditate quite intensely in a way that's guided by meditation, like memorizing mantras and so forth. And I had a doctor in Berlin, and I had all these skin issues and digestion problems, and he said, "Do you ever think of getting off of this medication for depression?" And I was like, "Oh, are you kidding? That could be the end." And he said, "No, I think that actually you could probably turn this around and it would give you an additional health boost." So, with monitoring from all these people, and I told everybody, I was like, "I'm going off this stuff. So, watch out. Just pay extra attention." But that was back in 2016, and I've never needed anything ever since. And I did feel a lot better, but the cost is got to keep on top of fitness, got to keep on top of diet, and meditation really, really helps. So, yeah, it's been an amazing turnaround, and even the people who listen to my podcast are like, they noticed the difference as it was happening, and I can't stand listening to those old podcasts because I sound so discombobulated. Like it was. So it's a public change in character that I myself can watch and see, and it's quite something.
And I want to go back to what you said with memory techniques. Can you just give me basic information on what those are?
Sure, sure. So memory techniques is a big topic, but the sort of core of it all has to do with association. So if I see a name like yours, and I haven't even asked you yet how you pronounce it, but if I guess that it's Vanzetta, right?
Yep,
Then
that's it.
I'm going to be thinking already in my mind, okay, so A Team is a series or a movie that has a very famous van. And then Zeta, starting to think Catherine Zeta-Jones or something. I think, is that what her name is?
Yeah. Hmm.
An actress. And you see, this is the funny thing about memory techniques is you don't even have to get the association correct as long as it makes sense to you, right? And
Yeah.
now I have that actress in a van, and I'm going to remember your name much, much better because of the association. And to take it to the next level, if I want to remember that for the long term, I'll place that image that I just created in a memory palace, which is again an association. So it's a mental version of a room, like the room I'm in now, and I would place, this Zeta Jones character in a van right here, but in my mind, in this version. And doing that, I mean, I can and I have memorized over 1,700 words in Sanskrit for meditation mantras.
Wow.
I can pull off Latin quotes, that you might not understand, but I can do it in Latin and then explain what they mean in English. And I've learned German to a high degree, or maybe an upper intermediate degree, I guess, and then pass some tests in Mandarin with this. I just have so much fun with memory techniques, and I memorize really strange and difficult poems. And I just literally do it that same way that I talked about with your name.
What is it like working with other people to have them learn these memory techniques as well?
Oh, it's so much fun. And there's so many different ways that people think about it and different ways that they approach it. And you can approach it different ways. But tied at the hip is always this principle of association. And it's kind of the number one challenge with it is helping them realize that you don't have to be creative. It's actually the opposite, because they often think that you have to have pictures in your mind, which you don't have to see anything in your mind. You can do it purely logically, and getting them to understand that when I think about A-Team and Zeta Jones, I'm not being creative at all. It's actually getting creativity out of the way so I can just play mental Lego. So that's a very rewarding challenge, because people think that it's different than what it is, and it's really just taking assembly blocks and using what's already in your mind.
You talked earlier about physical activity and then memory and mental health and all that. How important is it to combine all those things?
Well, it's a contradiction, because I used memory techniques when I barely did exercise at all, and when I was in university, like when I look back, it's like, of course you were depressed, man. Like I used to get up or be up at 3 in the morning, and there was a grocery store called Sobeys, and I would be ordering pizza at some place that was open all night, and then stopping at the grocery store to get ice cream, and then going home and eating all this stuff while drinking beer, and then I would memorize stuff using memory techniques, and I would still recall the stuff, right? But I didn't feel good at all, other than this little beaming light of accomplishment that the memory techniques create, and this it's probably cognitive reserve or something like that that helps put the depression at bay a little bit. But once I started to exercise and so forth, I guess the key thing is that you start to be able to pay attention a lot better and a lot faster, and everything just works better. Everything has a shine. And there are also things about exercise that improve memory. So, I'm not a physician or anything like that, but there's more blood flow to the brain, which is going to help with memory. And then there's things that I've only read studies about them, but anecdotally they help. Like walking backwards, for example, can help memory. And I try to walk backwards at least 3 times a week in a safe place to do it, at an outdoor gym. And people look at me like it's the strangest thing in the world. But it's not only shown to be good for your memory, but it's shown to be good for your knees, which I could definitely use. So when your knees, for example, are in less pain, your memory is already better because you can pay attention better, because you're not lost in suffering. So it's a bit of a contradiction. I've been in some pretty dark places and still used memory techniques to pull off stunts and demonstrations and get my PhD, for example. But it's just been way, 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 way better when I had fitness and diet in the mix.
When I was doing my research, I saw you did a TEDx. What was that like?
That was wild. It was especially wild because it was just before the lockdowns were starting to happen. And I even went to my doctor and I was like, should I really be going to Melbourne right now? Like, what if I bring back this infection to Brisbane? And she said, well, there's no vaccine for it yet. And, just go live your life. Don't worry about it. And I still worried about it when I was there because it was spooky. Like, everybody was worried about it. And the streets were starting to already feel quite empty in Melbourne. And it was just, it was weird. But in terms of having the experience of speaking from memory, I don't know. I mean, I think it must have done well because lots of people have seen it, but it's kind of not my favorite thing to do, to memorize speeches. I like to memorize poems, and I like to learn a language, but to memorize a speech, I'd rather just talk, off the cuff.
Yeah.
So it was a strange thing for me to do because it feels quite artificial to speak that way, but it connects you with your ancestors because that's the way the Roman orators used to do it. In fact, the convention in English where we say when we're talking in an argument or whatever, in the first place, and secondly, that's actually something they did in their speeches because they were talking about their memory palaces, and the audience would know that they could actually use their own memory palaces to memorize that point. So when he's saying in the first place, he's literally saying in the first place of my memory palace, this is what I'm going to talk about. And then secondly, this is what I'm going to talk about. And people would just memorize along with the speech. So that was a cool thing to memorize a speech and really connect with that ancient tradition.
What was it like connecting with an audience?
Well, I really made a point to look them in the eyes and actually address them in the talk and try to get that feeling that I was also aware of the camera. And I think it's really great. But it's an unusual environment because there are other speakers there of the day, right? So it's an audience that has your peers at the same time. So I'm not sure exactly how to describe it, and it's a cultural phenomenon. You know, the whole idea that this is a kind of talk as opposed to any other kind of talk that you could give. It has a certain weight or a pedigree or something like that. So you feel like you really have to deliver in a way that is not for the audience. You kind of have to represent the TED brand, I guess. So it's kind of a connecting and not connecting at the same time. You're almost trying to connect with the actual institution that you're participating in a way, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I feel like I managed to balance all those things, but it was interesting to have to, or at least I felt like I had to balance all of those things.
What do you do to help your own mental health?
Well, I meditate pretty much every day, pretty much at the same time, and I do a very specific meditation. And the meditation itself has some ancient Sanskrit that basically is designed to help you not take your thoughts too seriously. So one of the sayings in Sanskrit is that a real thought is as rare as a rabbit with horns, which is just hilarious. And that helps because my mind is quite busy. I've had experiences of no mind, which is blissful, but usually my mind is just blah, 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 blah. But having this ability to really stop and, just notice that these thoughts are not real is very, very helpful in a mental health sort of sense. And another thing that I do is I try to bring back various phrases and sayings because it's very easy for me to take things too seriously, and then that can create mental blips that are not quite positive. So I try to remember things like, it's just a game, or I look at numbers on a screen with YouTube, and I often just say that, numbers on a screen, and just laugh at it because they're like a rabbit with a horn, like it means something, but it doesn't really mean anything. And I think my favorite one to remind myself of that helps over and over and over and over and over again is an ancient story about Alexander the Great meeting Diogenes in Athens. And Diogenes was famous for sitting in a barrel on the street. And Alexander says, "Hey, aren't you Diogenes?" And Diogenes is like, "Yeah, whatever, man. Who else would be sitting in a barrel on the street?" And Alexander says, "Well, you're my favorite philosopher. Look, your wish is my command. You name it, I will give it to you." And Diogenes looks up at Alexander the Great and he says, "Get out of my sun." And Alexander says, "Diogenes, if I weren't already Alexander the Great, I would want to be you." And it's just like the most extraordinary story, because how often do we allow a cloud to get in the way of just this moment, instead of saying, "Get out of my sun." So those are some of the things that I do. And then 3 days a week at the gym, and I eat a very strict diet in order to avoid essentially what were food reactions that caused all that depression. And so as long as I stick to the straight and narrow with my diet, it's just smooth sailing. And then, work on the mind part as well. And when it's not smooth sailing, then I've just got these phrases to remind me to get the clouds out of the sun.
What is it like sharing your values with other people?
Well, it's great. It's great. It can be intense because I get a lot of email from people who then share their stories, and I wouldn't ever want that to stop. But I try to express to them that the things that I have learned from my teachers have come from thinking about it deeply, and then not making it that I have to follow their path. And I learned that from a guy named Gary Weber, and he said, whatever you do, learn from teachers, but don't try to reproduce their journey. And so I get kind of repetitive on this point, but I often just point out to people, whatever I'm saying, whatever's coming out of this mouth, question it. Doesn't matter whose mouth it comes out of. Question, question, question. Because really the only value that's worth having is the value of questioning and questioning questions. Even questioning the idea of questions itself. So I think it's a big responsibility, actually, is what it is. And to try to always keep to calling a spade, and not taking things too seriously, but then always taking them so seriously that if you're going to call it valuable, then what is value? Question. What exactly is so valuable about anything?
Yeah.
And keep your ego in check, because the ego is a savage and sinister thing, and it can creep up in the strangest moments. But really, my value is to question, and to question even the notion of what is value, or what is life even. So I think it's an interesting thing, and a great question to ask itself. So thanks for that.
Where do you want to see your mission in the next few years?
Well, there's the practical answer to that, and then there's the more philosophical answer. And I'll start with the philosophical answer. I belong to a tradition, really. The memory techniques that I teach have been around for thousands of years. There have been some of the strangest and most wonderful people who have taught it, and they have had adventures far in excess of anything that I've ever seen. And some of those adventures I don't even want, because they went through some crazy times with teaching memory techniques. But I think of it kind of like the Batman suit, It shouldn't be about Bruce Wayne. Anybody should be able to step into the suit as long as they have the basic acrobatics and they have the scientific understanding to make smoke bombs or whatever, batarangs, it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with a mental Lego where you take alphabetical sounds and you match them with others, and it's a skill that can be taught like a martial art. So where I would like it to see is already guaranteed. As long as there are where I'd like it to see go, it's just guaranteed. As long as there's humans, there's going to be people who realize that you can make associations like this, and they're going to teach it. So that's great. I don't have to worry about that at all. But for myself, my wife and I are in the middle of developing a real memory palace in a physical location where people can come and they'll see the alphabet on the floor, and there'll be a functioning bookshop inside of there, and we can teach the art of memory within a space that has been optimized to teach the technique, so that it doesn't have to be so theoretical all the time. Like, I often have to teach it by doing what I did with you, like saying, okay, so we got the van from the A-team, and we're going to stick that with your name. But how cool would it be if we could actually walk to a place and say, look, here's V on the floor. And once upon a time, I had an interview with Michael Vanzetta, and this V here is exactly where I stuck his name, because that's where V is on the floor. And then people will more be able to get what a memory palace is and how it functions. So it's very, very exciting. It's the most challenging thing I've ever done. Never spent so much time with lawyers and with contracts and with permits, and it's just bizarre. But that's where things are going. There's a risk that I won't be able to pull it off to completion, but it's well on its way, and it's just one permit away from starting the renovation, and it's wild. And I hope people will come. And then part of that idea is when I can pull off the actual physical location part, outside is a nice strip of grass, and I sometimes notice every once in a while they have a stage that they build, and they have performers come, like Elvis impersonators and stuff like that. And my idea is, what if we could have a combination of memory competition and TEDx talks, where people will come to this real memory palace, but then every year there will be this event where 5 weeks before the event happens, the people who are going to give speeches have to incorporate in their speeches information from 5 books that have just come out in that 5-week period, and they have to include in their speech a quote, something to do with numbers, and they have to write it by hand, so they submit it by hand. So we know that if they used a ChatGPT or whatever, that they actually went through the pain of copying whatever they stole from a robot. But also, the ChatGPT shouldn't know what's in these books because they just came out, and their speech has to revolve around that. And then there'll be a prize or whatever. I have to talk to lawyers about what it's like to run a contest and all this sort of stuff. But I think that memory competitions are great, but they're missing meaning. So I've been to a competition. I memorized a bunch of playing cards, and it's like, yeah, so what? I mean, what am I going to do with those playing cards? Forget them, right? But imagine people come and they craft a speech that they memorize, and that speech incorporates wisdom and knowledge and facts, stuff that you would want to remember. So it becomes now the people watching the speeches go, wow, that's a good point. How do I remember it? Well, that's the point of the competition, is to encourage you to learn the technique. So, and the stage can be used as a memory palace, etc. So anyway, that's the vision. Lots of work to do, but that's where we're headed.
What are some of the things you've learned from your wife?
Oh, I've learned to be quiet and be patient. And I mean, she's a very quiet person, and quiet is one of her great survival tools. And she's a very patient person. So that has rubbed off on me quite a bit. And I've learned a heck of a lot of Mandarin from her because she's a native speaker. And just really just learned that it is possible to find a person who shares your own goals, which I'd never used to believe, and like really shares them and is devoted to them and is willing to make similar sacrifices. So I learned that miracles are possible, basically.
How can people reach out and learn more?
Well, my website is magneticmemorymethod.com, and if you search Magnetic Memory Method, it should come up. Even just Memory and Anthony should probably come up, and there's a free course on my site, and as you mentioned, there's the TEDx, so probably if you put Anthony Memory TEDx, then that'll show up, and that gives a good sort of overview of some of my story and some of the values that I have and what I'm trying to do in memory, which is not just to remember stuff, but to remember stuff that actually matters and is transformative and positive.